and thanks for tuning in to the Path 11 podcast. I am your host, April Hanna. At the Path 11 podcast, we are here trying to deliver leading-edge research on consciousness, healing, and metaphysics. And just like you, we are trying to answer the big questions about life. Who are we? Why are we here? And what is our purpose? We hope by listening to our podcast, it will make each day you live on Earth a little easier to understand. And now for today's podcast. So today on the Path 11 podcast, I am joined with best-selling author of Breaking Open the Head, Daniel Pinchbeck. He teamed up with an anthropologist, Sophia Rocklin, to write the first comprehensive look at ayahuasca and the global renaissance it's created with psychedelic drugs. We're going to be talking about that book today, and it is called When Plants Dream. So I would like to welcome Daniel on our show. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. And I just wanted to remind our listeners, too, that we've had a couple of people on talking about the plant of ayahuasca. For you listening today, you guys can check out episode 90 and 97. We interviewed Christine Breeze and Rachel Harris, and they covered a little bit of what Daniel and Sophia also covered in their book about what ayahuasca is, the plant, how to use that in ceremony, and also how sometimes people can use it for transformational purposes of healing depression and PTSD. So Daniel, we'll probably have you talk a little bit about that, but I really learned so much from this book in other areas that I'm hoping we get to cover on, just the laws around ayahuasca, the legality of it, some of the misuse that has been happening, and just kind of where it's going today in the world. So welcome, and maybe we can start off if you'd like to share your first experience with ayahuasca, because you mentioned that in the book.
I think it was like 1998 or something. And really, it was, very much not a big phenomenon at that point. I was in New York, and I'd started exploring psychedelics again in my late 20s out of a kind of spiritual quest in a way, like wanting to see if there was a way to learn more about the nature of consciousness or the psyche. And it was the investigations that were later, published in my first book, Breaking Open the Head. And I first did it. It was two shamans from California. I think there was just like two or three of us who drank in a apartment by the Hudson River downtown. And I didn't have like very, very deep visions that day, but I guess I had enough vision, enough sense that there was something possibly profound about the experience that I was inspired to go deeper.
Great, wonderful. And like you said, too, if people are interested, they can also read your book, Breaking Open the Head, there as well. So why don't we just touch a little bit upon, just in case if our listeners have not listened to those episodes, do you want to just give a little more education about the plant of ayahuasca, why it's used and how it can be helpful, I guess, in consciousness and healing our consciousness, delving into other realms, and maybe we could start there, and then we'll move into some other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Throughout South and Central America, we've discovered a number of different visionary plants that were used sacramentally in many indigenous cultures. Whether it's peyote in Mexico or San Pedro in Peru, yopo in Brazil. And then in the 20th century, well, I guess even in the 19th century, we were actually even some of the colonialists noticed it. It also turns out that there's a drink, a psychedelic drink, a medicine, as they call it, that's made from two plants, usually brewed together for many hours. And one of those plants, the brew itself is called ayahuasca, but it's made up of two plants that are brewed together. One is the ayahuasca vine, or Banisteriopsis caapi, which contains MAO inhibitors. And the second one is a Psychotria viridis, a bush that contains the leaves contain dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which is a psychedelic compound that is normally recognized by your gut and then kind of neutralized if you try to eat it. But because it's mixed with the MAO inhibitors in the ayahuasca vine, it becomes orally active. And whereas if you could smoke DMT, you might have a 10-minute experience that's extremely jarring and overwhelming. But when it's mixed with the ayahuasca potion, it can be more of like a 3 to 5 hour kind of visionary journey.
Yeah, and you talk about in the book too, how it can really help people. A lot of people who have taken it will come out of these experiences having really profound experiences where it can help people that have struggled with addiction, depression, PTSD. And do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're undergoing our learning phase as a culture. Basically, as I particularly explored in Breaking Open the Head, the whole area of psychedelics and mind expansion had really been suppressed by European and American civilization. And then in the 50s, these things were kind of rediscovered. LSD was discovered in the 40s in Europe. Gordon Wasson discovered the mushrooms, that the Mazateks were using in Mexico. I guess Richard Schultes was one ethnobotanist from Harvard who began to chronicle use of ayahuasca. And so what we've been discovering is that it has uses medicinally, for a lot of psychological conditions, depression, these things, work for obsessive compulsive disorder, for PTSD. There's actually a really nice documentary film that was just made called From Shock to Awe, which focuses on Iraq veterans who have treatment-averse forms of PTSD, who work in it with a ayahuasquero in Florida, and completely break out of their syndrome. And so that's it's basically this. Ayahuasca is one of a class of substances that we're discovering have more and more positive mental health benefits when they're used properly. MDMA is obviously another one that was originally developed as a therapy tool in the 70s, that it was outlawed because of the connection to rave culture, and now there's actually very intense clinical trials going on. I think it's phase 3 FDA trials to have MDMA used as a treatment tool for post-traumatic stress disorder. And they're finding it has like a 60% cure rate, even in treatment-averse forms of PTSD. We're really just at the beginnings. And we talked in the book about eating disorders and ayahuasca. We talked about depression. We talked about all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, it's a very comprehensive book, and yeah, you're right. There's a lot more clinical trials, with this stuff, as well as like psilocybin. That's another thing that I was learning about this year as well, and the clinical trials that are going on with that and helping people to treat these things. So it's interesting that it's kind of coming around back full circle.
Definitely.
Yeah. When you mentioned Florida, too, I thought it was really interesting in your book when you were talking about the Soul Quest Church of Mother Earth in Orlando, Florida. I'm like, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Because that's also one of the things, too. It's like when you hear about ayahuasca, if you really don't have much information about it, I think one of the first questions is, well, how do I experience this? Who do I know? It seems to be so underground in so many ways, where these private ceremonies are happening, and, you have to know someone who knows someone who knows someone, and I was not familiar with the Soul Quest Church of Mother Earth in Orlando, Florida, and found that to be kind of interesting in how you told that story. Do you want to share that with our audience?
Which story in particular?
About the founder, Christopher Young, and how what was interesting was like how they knew that this was going on there, but there wasn't like a whole lot of stuff that took place like within the law, and they were like threatening, I think, to shut it down, but that never really happened either.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's an interesting guy. He came from kind of like a, more like lower class background, and then he had an awakening with ayahuasca, I think, in Ibiza, and really wanted to share it with the world. And I think he discovered that you could register with the Native American Church, which provides some protection for medicine practices, and where most of the people I've known over the last decades who've been involved with it have been held it pretty close to their chest, and it's been kind of like an underground railroad where you have to kind of know somebody and to do it in the U.S. because the legality is very unclear. Chris is just kind of like gone for it, and he's been marketing SoulQuest and doing, quite inexpensive treatments. Like he really wants to make it, medicine for the people. And while the FDA has definitely been interested in his activities, so far they have not shut him down.
Right. Yeah. So let's go into talking about just the law. We're talking about in your book the lawmakers and how they schedule substances on a scale from 1 to 5. So I was just hoping that you can educate our audience a little bit about that and what's going on with the law and ayahuasca.
Yeah, I mean, just for some history, in the 60s, the late 50s, psychologists in Europe and America started to rediscover these psychedelics or discover them. And they were really amazed by their potential and believed that they were the most powerful tools for exploring the human psyche and the human mind that we'd ever found. However, as they got released into the counterculture and kind of, mixed in with the civil rights movement and, all these different movements that were happening in the 60s, they were kind of seen as a culprit by the establishment. So in 66, they began the process of making them all very illegal. And by 1970, with the Controlled Substances Act, psychedelics were all Schedule 1, which meant they were, the highest characterization of drugs that have a high potential for abuse and no positive value. So that, and that basically put an end to scientific studies. They were written out of the medical textbooks. When I wrote Breaking Open the Head in like around 2000, you really still couldn't even talk about psychedelics with a straight face publicly. People would just laugh at you, ridicule. The Times called them toys of the hippie generation. And so with the psychedelic renaissance, the legality is beginning to shift. And in fact, ayahuasca has been a little bit on the forefront of that. I mean, first of all, case around peyote with the Native American Church, and they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against the Native American Church, and so it was going to be a state's issue. But then actually there was a lot of pressure on Congress, so Congress issued an Emergency Religious Freedoms Proclamation. Kind of based on that, there's ayahuasca is not only used by indigenous groups and mestizo shamans. There are also a number of religions from Brazil that started in the 1920s when essentially the mestizo culture began to encounter the indigenous cultures in the Amazon. People who were working as border guards or rubber tappers made friends with the local indigenous groups, started drinking ayahuasca with them, and they were from this Catholic background, and when they had their visions, they would see kind of this melding of Christian and indigenous imagery and iconography, and that led to several new religions, including Santo Daime and one called União de Vegetal. The American group of União de Vegetal, the leader of it was from a very wealthy family, the Bronfman family, and the Seagram's fortune and MGM. And when, I can't remember exactly the year now, maybe 2003 or something, the government kind of raided União de Vegetal, took all of their, plant medicine, but he had the deep pockets to fight a case all the way through the Supreme Court that actually won at the Supreme Court level the right to use ayahuasca as a sacrament. And then following upon that a few years later, Santo Daime, União de Vegetalis, is a very secretive, not very proselytizing religion. Daime is a little bit more open to the public, but the Daime won a significant case, I believe, in Oregon around protection of ayahuasca for sacramental use. So kind of since then, the government has been kind of like not as, kind of interested in this whole area. And I mean, there have been a few other one South American shaman was taken into custody for transporting the medicine. Then ultimately, I think he was actually let go. So there feels to me this kind of like, it's not totally clear, but a kind of like, tacit acceptance of ayahuasca right now. But obviously, if somebody was to push that into obvious a way, or if there are any deaths that start to be associated with ayahuasca use, the legal framework could change very, very quickly. So it's kind of at a delicate place right now.
Right. And speaking about the deaths, the other thing that you really cover too is the misuse of this, what to look out for. How do you know that you're really, going into a ceremony with a legit shaman or person that can facilitate this? And I was blown away by the story that you had in your book about Kyle Nolan. So can we talk a little bit about what people should look out for? Maybe we can even share the story of Kyle Nolan and what happened there in that situation, and how, the person that was leading these ceremonies was actually quite horrible. And, not that you want to instill fear in people, but I think that it's really important, especially, maybe people like myself that we don't know a whole lot, but interested in the experience and how, it can work with our own consciousness. But, do we really have the tools, and have we dug deep to do the research to know what a safe ceremony is and who we can entrust in bringing us through this type of journey?
Right. Well, I guess, as I said, the modern world is now kind of like developing, a new relationship to kind of the, kind of esoteric realms and the sacred realms and the healing realms that one can access through plant medicine. In a way, like in the modern, or the last 5 or 10 years of the psychedelic renaissance, the focus has been very much on science and personal healing, and creating a kind of culture of positivity around the value of these things, which is all true. But there's also, as something I've discussed in my past work in Breaking Open the Head and my other book 2012, there's also this idea of initiation. And in tribal societies, you would often, go through kind of initiatory experiences using visionary plants. And, those can also be very threatening. Like the idea of initiation requires to go through like a liminal zone, passing through kind of like the death space, the spirit realm, the demon realm. For the shamanic cultures, there are all these different worlds of spirits that we can contact, particularly easily to contact them when we're in these altered states or transpersonal states. Yes, when you sighed, you kind of like drifted me off my thought structure there.
Yeah, no, I was just taking a deep breath in. I was shaking my head like, yes, keep going. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to distract you.
What was the original question again? It was about
just about like, how do we practice this safely? What is it that we're...
So the first thing I was going to say is that I'm not sure that you can practice it totally safely, because, and I think that, it's a very modern, but, also everything we do involves some level of danger or risk, like driving a car, upstate, your car could get hit by another car, walking to the store, you can get, mugged or something, but I mean, here, there are some risks, just even without worrying about manipulative other people, because they open up gateways in the psyche. And, that's why, most kind of responsible shamans or clinics that use plant medicine have like a screening process where they really want to make sure that people don't have, underlying psychological issues that might come out during ceremony. And, sometimes it does happen, even if there's no, sense that somebody had an issue. So these are, things that need to be respected. There are dangers with, exploring consciousness in this way. It's just a reality. I mean, even, Michael Pollan in his recent book described some, experiences that were difficult for him to assimilate. You're opening yourself to these other dimensions of consciousness, and it's never going to be quite so simple as just like, like taking a aspirin or something like that.
Right. And once you have an experience like this, just that integration too, say it's a positive experience, you can't really unsee what you saw or, what you experienced. You come out of it a different person, it does change and can alter the consciousness.
Well, that's the whole idea of initiation. You actually are meant to become a different person. Like you have to die to the old self and, step out of the ego and then kind of be able to, look at the world, in a kind of deconditioned or deprogrammed way,
Right. Now, have you had any experience or have spoken to people about maybe people who went through a ceremony and it actually did trigger more, mental illness, or ignited something that made it really difficult for them to reintegrate back in? And how does one recover from an experience like that? I mean, do they go back to traditional mental health therapy? What are kind of the repercussions of that? Or do you know somebody that maybe had that experience and then was able to come out either of psychosis from that?
Sure. I mean, look, I've known at this point, I've been on this stuff, Breaking With Head came out in 2002. I started learning about, ayahuasca in the late 90s and other psychedelics. And, I've known many thousands and heard of many thousands of people who've gone through these experiences. The vast majority of them are, had incredible times and are very grateful and didn't have big problems. But yeah, I've also, seen people, end up, in going and taking sports or, really being unable to reintegrate for a while. Generally, those people have been, ultimately okay, but they had to pass through a kind of, difficult passage,
And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but, when you begin to explore consciousness and you're able to open up to the greater reality and understand that there are so many other dimensions, and many times in traditional mental health therapy, I come from that background and trained in it, but once I kind of took the path of consciousness, it made me really look at stuff much, much differently and saying, maybe people who we think are, quote unquote, out there, really aren't out there, but maybe they're more sensitive to see and experience things that we are blocking ourselves from and having the ability to. So what are your thoughts about that? I know that we may call it psychosis, and granted, there really are, some things that happen within, the mind, but also, how do we argue that what maybe some people are experiencing isn't a true reality either?
Yeah, I mean, from the kind of indigenous shamanic perspective, most of what we can think about as mental illnesses, they would see as like spiritual afflictions, like evil spirits or evil spirits from the ancestor lines that like possess people. And I think it's just as legitimate a way to understand, various types of mental health issues.
Yeah, I remember speaking to someone that had a totally different view on schizophrenia, and that sometimes what is happening with that individual consciousness is that they are really able to experience and have access to kind of parallel dimensions that are happening all at the same time, and can make it very difficult for them to ground and to be in the reality here on Earth, because for whatever reason, they're able to access almost like too many dimensions going on at once. I thought that to be interesting. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But I do find that compelling. I think first of all, that's like there's big news in the rediscovery of the psychedelic experience, is that there do seem to be these multiple dimensions, or like, many, many different kind of body-mind states that we actually experience, different types of information and knowledge and resonance and so on. I think that's really wonderful, because the modern scientific worldview has had a little bit of a tendency to kind of, want to create the sense of closure. Like we're shutting down, reality. Like we know that, the world is only this, and it's only matter, and it's only atoms, and, space is infinite and empty, and so on. And so, the psychedelic experience is a phenomenological and metaphysical, experience that, for many people, leads to a change or transformation in their understanding of themselves in relationship to nature and the cosmos.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So why don't we talk a little bit about where you think ayahuasca is evolving to, just, in our Western culture? What is the future of this, and what are you seeing?
Well, so, there's a number of different strands there. I mean, one is at the moment there's beginning to be a bit of a supply and demand problem. In fact, Sophia Rocklin, who was my co-author on the book and a dear friend, is actually working on a program in Peru to now help indigenous communities to sustainably grow ayahuasca for the global market. The problem being that, in this ayahuasca boom of the last 15 years, a lot of the old vines are being stripped away, and there hasn't been a lot of focus on how to create it takes 7 years for the vine to reach maturity, so it's not an easy process.
Wow.
So that's one issue. There needs to be more concerted effort to make sure that we're sustaining the supply of ayahuasca. I think it's we're going to see more. Yeah, it just seems like a very big growing interest in this area, and for me also, as I said before, sort of insinuated before, it's gotten a little bit stuck in the self-help and self-care idea, which is so such a big focus of our culture. For me, I'm very interested in how the psychedelic experience, and maybe particularly ayahuasca above all, contributes to a individual becoming aware of, let's say, the ecological crisis that we're facing as a species, and how, in a way, we need to access new reservoirs of courage and understanding to transform ourselves and our communities as we're facing a threat to the very future of our existence that is self-created by our technologies. And I feel in a way that the psychedelic substances, particularly the natural ones like ayahuasca and mushrooms, are kind of like nature's counteractive. They're frantically seeking to point our attention in a different direction and see that there's a sort of inherent and intrinsic connection between the perceiving self and the world. And unless we actually do that inner work of consciousness and then express that inner work through, kind of outer actions in the world that are altruistic for other people, that are connective, that, build community and so on, we basically miss the message of the medicine.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, to educate me more about this plant. It's been really fascinating, I would say, in the last year and a half or two. I really started to delve more into, the research of this. So I'm still at the beginning paths of it. Haven't actually experienced it myself, but that may be something in my future. But it was really just wonderful to speak with you, to have your knowledge, your education, and your passion about this on the Path 11 podcast. So thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, if people want to check out my work, there's One Plant Stream is the latest book. How Soon Is Now was a book that looks at the a system design perspective on the ecological crisis and the solutions for dealing with it. 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoat looked at the prophetic indigenous knowledge systems of cultures like the Hopi and the Maya and correlated them with Western thought, thinkers like Heidegger and Jung and Rudolf Steiner. And Breaking Open the Head was my first book that really chronicled my own kind of initiatory journey through shamanism.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it was so nice that our paths crossed, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. Thank you so much.
Have a great one.
Thanks for listening to the Path 11 podcast today. I hope you all enjoyed this show. And if you haven't checked out our Patreon page, I'd like you to do so because we are going to start putting some content over there that is only for our Patreon subscribers. You can get content for as little as donating $1 a month, and it could just be a one-time donation. We have other freebies over there that you can get depending upon how much you would like to donate. And again, it could be a one-time donation, or you can continue to keep your subscription on a monthly basis at that donation level. But I just put my MBT immersive experience, which was a 4-day intensive meditation training in Tennessee with physicist Tom Campbell. I was listening to binaural beats, going to altered states of consciousness, having out-of-body experiences and life-changing experiences that I was able to bring back for myself, for my clients, for my friends. That was just out of this world. So if you would like to listen to that, I'd like you to head on on over to path11podcast.com. You're going to see an orange button that says Patreon. Become a Patreon today, and you can have access to that podcast. And I would like to remind you to head on over to path11productions.com and check out the membership that we have for the Afterlife Awareness Conference. We have over 25 hours of footage with amazing speakers like William Buhlman, Thomas John, Terry Daniel, Suzanne Geisman, Suzanne Northrup, Linda Fitch, Austin Wells, just a few people to name off that were amazing. These workshops are just so valuable. So I think that you would really enjoy it. It's also a great thing to think about to maybe give the gift to somebody who is struggling with grief. If you are looking for resources, this is a great conference to send people to check out. And thanks again for listening today.